Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So today's discussion is going to be about something pretty technical. It's a topic that I was asked to discuss by a close friend and colleague of mine who was struggling to teach this material in an accessible way to some of their students. And so they asked me to put this video together as a kind of primer or introductory tutorial on a somewhat advanced topic in Buddhist logic and epistemology, which is the theory of Apoha, or concept formation through negation in Buddhism. So the way into this topic, I think, is to just start with some very general remarks about the nature of universals. And a universal is something like cowness or redness. Those things that all cows and red things have that make it true of them to say that they are cows or that they are red. So universals play a very important role in helping us organize our thoughts about particular things, because universals are those things in virtue of which we can say of particulars that they are what they are. And so the questions that come up for philosophers when we recognize the role that universals play in helping us think about particular things as being instantiations of more general things are the following. What is a universal? What sort of being is it? Are universals real? And if so, how? How could they be real? And in what way are they real? The most famous answer to this question comes to us from Plato and Plato's theory of forms, which is an attempt to answer these questions. Plato believes that forms, universals, are the most real things that there are. And it is their sensible instantiations in the form of particulars that we see around us, that we perceive with our senses, that are by comparison less real. And this is because for Plato, what is sensible is less real than what is intelligible. But Buddhist philosophers like Dignaga and Dharmakirti are going to deny the existence of universals. And the reason that Buddhist philosophers want to deny the existence of universals is that if a universal were to exist, it would likely have to be something permanent, unchanging, that in virtue of which all particulars that instantiate the relevant universal are able to do so. This is what Plato's theory of forms asserts, for example, that there are these eternal forms. But since Buddhists are of the commitment, or have the commitment rather, that everything is impermanent, anicca, the Buddhists must argue on doctrinal grounds that there are no universals. The Apoha or exclusion theory of universals that the Buddhists come up with is an attempt to replace a substantive theory of universals by claiming that our concepts, the things that we use to think about particulars as falling under universals, function or are able to refer to things in an exclusionary way rather than an inclusionary way. What does that mean? Well, that's what we're going to unpack today. So here's a brief quote from chapter 5 of Dignaga's Pramana Samuchaya, which says that a word excludes others, and a word indeed speaks about things qualified by the exclusion of others. So what Dignaga is trying to say here is that for a concept to do the job of referring to particulars, it's going to have three properties: the property of unity, the property of permanence, and a condition of belonging for each member of a class of things falling under the concept. But then he's going to spell this out in a highly counterintuitive way that is going to try and undercut our desire to posit the existence of universals as permanent, unchanging entities. So here he continues in his auto commentary on the 36th verse of chapter 5. He says that an exclusion of contrary meanings has unity because it is undivided. It has permanence because its substratum is not destroyed, and it has the condition of belonging to each member in a class because it is cognized in every object in the word's extension. So he's trying to give us an argument here, I think, that's pretty straightforward, but a little bit elliptical. So he's claiming that the Apoha theory that he's about to lay out meets the criteria necessary for a theory of concepts by having those three properties I just mentioned. But the Apoha theory does not postulate the existence of abstract entities with substantial properties. It is in that sense ontologically conservative. Ontologically conservative theories that can do the same explanatory work as ontologically robust theories, in this case, realist theories of universals, are to be preferred over ontologically robust theories, and therefore the Apoha theory is to be preferred over realist theories and concepts. So my concept of a cow or cowness, which can be accurately predicated of all particular cows, does so not in virtue of tracking some universal cowness present in every particular cow, but by excluding all non-cows. So the concept cow accurately represents a particular cow in the world in virtue of predicating the cow with a double negation, such that the particular cow is understood cognitively as not a non-cow. So by giving us an exclusionary theory of concept reference, the Buddhist epistemologist attempts to sidestep the need to posit the existence of universals which ground the instantiation of the particular quality in this individual thing. So a cow isn't a cow because it partakes of cowness. A cow can be thought of as a cow because in doing so, I've excluded all non-cows. Now, the solution to the problem of reifying universals here is elegant, but it brings with it some pretty hefty questions. The first one, there are two that I want to explore, and here's where answering these questions will give us an opportunity to think a little bit together about Dharma Kirti's attempt to develop the Apoha theory. So two questions arise at this juncture for the Apoha theorist. First, in virtue of what does our possession of the concept, for example, the concept of cow, allow us to exclude non-cows if the concept does not contain in its structure information for inclusion of cows? More straightforwardly, how can a concept exclude without inclusion criterion? The second one is, how are these concepts formed? How do we acquire concepts such that we can use them in inferences? Dharma Kirti is going to try and answer these questions, and his account of Apoha will attempt to go a little further than Dignaga managed. Specifically, his account of Apoha will address those two questions I raised by focusing on the role of causation and what we'll call karmic imprinting, the idea that the world is impacting me in a way that is somewhat regular and predictable, and that concepts are strategies that we develop for trying to manage patterns of impact that the world has on us in virtue of our being alive in it. And that these help us sort of as heuristics for interacting with the world in perception and action. So let's get into Dharmakirti's view a little bit. So Dharmakirti will claim that smoke is fire's effect, because the characteristic of being its effect is distributed over all instances of smoke. And he continues that since that which is causeless does not depend on anything else, it would be either permanently existent or permanently non-existent. Things occur intermittently because they are dependent. So there are two views being expressed here that I want to make very clear. The first is a view about causation and how things exist in virtue of being causally related. And the second is what that tells us about the nature of existence for things that don't have causes and effects. So the first view that is being expressed is something like the following. We may say of Y that it is the effect of its cause X on account of Y being observed in all instances of X, as well as Y not ever being observed in the absence of X. This is just a technical invocation of a basic Buddhist principle called dependent origination, which says in its most broadest and simplest formation that with the arising of this, that arises, and with the cessation of that, this also ceases. Dharmakirti is inheriting this definition and is claiming further that the mark of something being real is that it has this kind of embeddedness in a causal matrix. Now, he also inherits a certain commitment to what is called Dharma Theory, which is the view that the most basic elements of reality are these atoms that arise and pass away momentarily. And because he believes that all particulars are momentary and densely integrated, he thinks that the causal conditions that realize the momentary arising and passing away of dharmas is almost infinitely complex, from which it follows that all particular existence are radically unique, because the way in which every particular thing arises and passes away in a dense causal interaction with all the other particulars around it means that there is no repeatable individual. Everything is radically unique. So that's going to be a very important point for him, and it can seem counterintuitive, but remember, he's not talking about persons or objects. He's talking about all of the momentary psychological and physical events and processes that aggregate together to give us the impression that there are persons and objects in the world, medium-sized dry goods. But he's operating at a level of description that is below that threshold, where everything is sort of arising and passing away with such rapidity that it's hard to even pin down what the basic elements are. The second view he's trying to establish here is that if something were causeless, if something didn't have its existence in virtue of being dependently originated in this dense way, it would be either eternal and unchanging or non-existent. Those are the options. And the reason he thinks that these are exhaustive options is that such a being that was causeless would have no way of having any connection through a process of transformation to the world in which it is realized. But it is an observable fact that phenomena are related in this way. And so he thinks the only way to talk about real existence insofar as they are real is in terms of their causal conditions. Okay. Causation is the only way to explain the relationships that exist between things in the world. So therefore, what it means to be real is to be embedded in a dense causal matrix. But since the density of the causal matrix is so extensive and nuanced, the existence of any particular thing will end up being non-repeatable when its integration into that causal network is properly understood. This leads us to a kind of nominalism, the view that only particular things exist. Now, here's where, now that we've set that out, we can start to understand in a more straightforward way what's motivating Dharmakirti by posing the following question. If everything is radically unique on account of the density of its causal origins, then why do we understand things in the world in terms of their similarities rather than their radical differences? Dharmakirti's answer here is quite incredible. And I'm going to read some passages and unpack them for you. And I just want to note that this is coming from John Dunn's excellent book on Dharmakirti, published by Wisdom Publications a number of years ago. So here's Dharmakirti. He says, real things are themselves different, but in conceptual cognition, they appear as non-different in that they appear in some single form. So when we conceptualize, we understand different particular things as being instantiations of a general thing. Those things appear that way in that their differentiation is obscured by an obscurative cognition, which obscures the form of something else, that is, those distinct real things, with its own form, that is the form of a single image. And that obscurative cognition, although based on those different real things, has the cognitive appearance of a single object. So what he's saying here is that the seeming similarities we take there to be between the things we perceive are there because of our conceptual apparatus imputing similarity on otherwise radically different things. So the similarities that we see between different cows are not present in the particular cows, but are projected onto the cows by us. That's the basic idea, which is a weird view, right? That's a very weird view. Why? Because if that's so, then why did it simply seem to us that the similarities we see between things in the world are a function of the things in the world being the way they are? We say of objects A, B, and C that they are chairs because those objects all seem to share in chairness. And whether we believe in there being a universal chairness or not is not the point here. The point is that on account of the individual chairs seeming to us to be a chair, they seem to share the same properties. So Dharmakirti's position here is very counterintuitive. And it's his response to this worry that I think makes his idea so interesting. He says, due to the intention of that cognition, a universal is commonly said to exist, cowness, chairness. But it does not ultimately exist in the way that it is conceptualized by that cognition. And here he explains further. He says, a conceptual awareness arises in dependence on things which are excluded from what is other than those that have the same cause or effect. In conformity with the nature of its imprints, that awareness conceals the distinct form of each of those things and ascribes to them its own non-different appearance. Doing so, that conceptual awareness conflates those things and presents them as non-different. Those things conceptualized as non-different are excluded from others, and that they have the same effects and causes. There is also a cognitive imprint, or a vasana, that induces one to conceptualize those things in that fashion. The nature of those distinct things themselves and the nature of the imprints as such that the cognition that arises for those things and that imprint appears in that way, that is such that those things seem non-different. Okay, that was a lot. There was a lot going on in that passage, and I'm only going to be able to unpack parts of it. But let me make a few points to try and clarify and unpack what he's claiming here. First, he wants to claim, following Dignaga, that concepts collect instances of themselves through exclusion rather than inclusion. So it's not that we group things together under a concept because they share certain properties, it's because they exclude certain things. In particular, what do they exclude? Particulars are excluded and included in a concept on the basis of their causal structure, on the basis of how their causes and effects impact us. And he spells this out in terms of this really important idea of imprinting or vasana. On account of our explicit purposes or intentions, and our tacit dispositions, our vasana. The causal structure of some particulars are classed as relevant or irrelevant to our goals. And this is the basis of their being included or excluded in a cognitive act of categorization. So it's not that we conceptualize particulars because of properties they share. It's that we conceptualize particulars in a certain way because of how those particulars are relevant or irrelevant to our goals and purposes. And this is important because what we do when we interact with the world is we intelligently ignore differences between things in order to make use of the things around us on account of their causes and effects, impacting us in paradigmatic ways that help define the scope of our intentions and our goals. And it is this ignoring of differences that allows our cognitive apparatus to classify things as similar. But in actuality, all particular things we perceive are radically different on account of their causal history and our causal history. So here's Dharmakirti again. Those who are analyzing universals distinguish the conceptually constructed image from the object. But people engaged in practical action do not. Thinking that their percept is capable of a telic function, those engaged in practical action unify the visible object with the conceptual object. And having done so, they act. It is in terms of the intention of persons engaged in practical action that the relationship between universals and particulars is explained in this way. That is, such that particulars which, by virtue of producing the desired effect, are different from those that do not produce the desired effect, and are made known as such by an expression whose direct object is necessarily universal. So, for example, when I feel cold and I need to build a fire to protect myself from the elements, my understanding of fire and the different kinds of fuel that I might burn to create it are actually, my concept of fire is constructed on the basis of a need to protect myself from cold. And so things that end up doing that share a certain similarity in virtue of excluding things that don't have the desired effect on me. So the upshot here is something like this. Because our actions are determined by our goals, we focus on the world and not on the way in which our minds structure the contents of our perception to help our actions get us to our goals. But it is on account of that focus, the world rather than what our mind is doing, when we are engaged in practical action, that we rarely realize that the direct object of our intentions is actually a conceptually constructed image of the world that we interpret as real for practical purposes. Okay. So that's the basics. And there's a lot more to this. This is arguably one of the most sophisticated domains of philosophy in classical India. And it is not just the purview of Buddhist philosophers like Dignaga and Dharmakirti. Many other thinkers engage with these Buddhist philosophers in an attempt to understand the nature of concept formation. But for my money, I think the thing that's really interesting and philosophically robust about Dignaga and Dharmakirti, especially Dharmakirti's development of Dignaga's idea, is the idea that categorization, the use of conceptual schemes to organize the contents of experience, are driven primarily by need, that we are practical agents negotiating a challenging world, and that concepts evolve in us as a heuristic for managing the complex causal relationships that we have with our environment, and that they give us inclusion and generality by excluding things that do not serve our purposes, that do not have the kinds of effects that we're trying to negotiate with and interpret. So that's all I have to say. I hope that that was helpful to you in some way. That's a primer on the Buddhist theory of concept formation in Dignaga and Dharmakirti. If you have any other requests for content that you would like me to cover that would be useful, please reach out to me either in the comments section or at askprofessorsmith@gmail.com. And I hope to see you again. Thanks and take care.